The cost of housing is extremely high in many places around the world, including the United States and especially right here in New York City. People who can't afford it have to pack up and leave, and some of them end up homeless. In response, a political movement called YIMBY thinks we can solve the problem by building more housing. They say it's just a matter of supply and demand. But a recent survey of Americans living in urban and suburban areas found that only about a third of us believe that increasing the housing supply will lower housing prices, with 42% saying it increases prices and 25% saying it has no effect. Why is it that so many people fail to see supply and demand for housing? Or is it somehow possible that they could actually be right? We need to figure this out so that we can actually lower housing prices. But there's more at stake than just affordability. Urban design affects our health, safety, happiness, and career prospects. It's also one of the biggest factors in environmental sustainability, including climate change. Across the United States, the state with the lowest per capita greenhouse gas emissions? New York. This is why. As an expert in climate change and other catastrophic risks, I know there's an urgent need to shift people from car-centric suburban sprawl to walkable, transit-friendly neighborhoods like this. But we can't do that if these neighborhoods are too expensive for people to live in. I've always assumed that we just need to build more urban housing. I published an article on this all the way back in 2004. But lately, I've been reading the research literature on housing prices, and I've got to say, when you look at the details, it makes sense that so many people don't think housing prices follow supply and demand. It's not because people are confused about economics. That same survey found that 86% of people do believe that a shortage of new cars would increase prices for used cars, which is correct. This year in the United States, we've had a shortage of new cars due to tariffs, and sure enough, the price of used cars went up, except for used Teslas. I think clearly the reason why so many people don't believe supply and demand applies to housing is because the housing market is complicated. So, in this video, I'm going to show you the research on housing prices, which reveals how housing markets actually work. The evidence shows that yes, building more housing generally lowers prices, but there are a few exceptions, and even when it happens, it can be hard to see. As for our housing policy, I'm going to argue that it should promote more housing construction, but it should also do some other things to handle the limitations of housing markets. A good place to start is the fact that housing developers want to build in neighborhoods with growing demand where prices are already rising. And so we might see new housing coincide with rising prices. That right there is a good reason for people to believe that housing prices do not follow the usual trends for supply and demand. Now, that could be confusing correlation with causation, an easy mistake to make. But if you dig in deeper, new housing can actually cause higher prices. Researchers call it the amenity effect. When a less affluent neighborhood gets a fancy new high-end apartment building, that brings in a bunch of wealthy new neighbors, and that brings in upscale restaurants and other amenities. Then, other wealthy people will see those amenities and they will want to live nearby, so they start bidding up the prices on the surrounding housing units. If you're one of the people who is already living in that neighborhood and now you can't afford it anymore, your own eyes are telling you that new housing caused prices to rise. You're probably going to be mad about it, and you're going to be entirely justified for feeling that way. That's the amenity effect. But there's also the supply effect. When new housing opens, some people from the surrounding neighborhood move in, so landlords have to lower rents to fill their old apartments. So, does a new apartment building make prices higher or lower in the surrounding neighborhood? That depends on which is larger, the supply effect or the amenity effect. Two different studies looked at this in New York City in roughly the same time period, around 2000 to 2015. And, go figure, using different research approaches, they reached opposite conclusions. One study found that within 500 feet of new apartment buildings, housing prices went down. The other study found that in neighborhoods that were rezoned to permit taller buildings were built and prices went up. It's possible that both studies are correct. it makes sense that sometimes the supply effect is larger and sometimes the amenity effect is larger. However, a more thorough study looking across the entire US did find that on average, rents went down by about 5 to 7%. That study was specifically looking at market rate housing built in low-income urban neighborhoods, which is exactly where you would expect the amenity effect to be the largest. So, it's pretty strong evidence that new housing reduces prices in the surrounding neighborhood, even for less affluent residents. For housing policy, this means that cities should feel very comfortable building more housing, but it can be also worth monitoring for the amenity effect and being prepared to support less affluent residents who are at risk of getting priced out of their communities. I think the ideal is to have neighborhoods that are economically diverse, so there's space for everyone, and we can have communities of people from all walks of life. There's actually some research finding that our economically segregated cities are killing the American dream. The idea that if you work hard, you can make it, regardless of your background. The research finds that children from poor families actually do better if they grow up in a small town where everyone knows everyone, even though the towns don't have as much educational and cultural resources as the cities do. That raises some big issues that go well beyond the cost of housing, like opportunity hoarding, the idea that wealthy and educated families hoard opportunities for their kids, making it harder for other kids to succeed. This does mean that if wealthy people are moving into a less affluent neighborhood, that could actually improve economic diversity in ways that might help less affluent residents if we can just manage to keep their housing affordable. But are we actually ready to have that policy conversation? Getting back to housing prices, there is one other complication. If wealthy people are moving into the neighborhood, that means they're also moving out of some other neighborhood, which means following supply and demand, we should see prices go down in the other neighborhood. Researchers call this a chain of moves, the sequence of new households that move into the homes that the previous households had moved out of. A study out of Helsinki, Finland, tracked 6 links in the chain of moves. In the first link, the people moving into the brand new housing, they tended to be wealthier, but in subsequent links, they were less and less wealthy. By the 6th link, there were about as many people from the bottom 20% income group as there were from the top 20%. Which means, even if housing is built for rich people, it can still free up housing for everyone else. It's like trickle-down economics, except that it actually works. Unlike trickle-down economics, it doesn't depend upon rich people spending their money in ways that help out everyone else. It just requires that when they move into a fancy new home, they move out of their slightly less fancy old home. But once again, there is a complication. That same study out of Helsinki found that sometimes the chain of moves gets broken. Someone moves into a home that had been empty, but the home they're moving out of does not become empty. About half the time, it was young adults moving out of their parents' homes. A third of the time, it was couples getting divorced. About 10%, it was roommates splitting up. And another 10% or so was miscellaneous other reasons. The study didn't say, but that other 10% could include wealthier people acquiring a second or a third home. What this means is that sometimes when you increase the supply of housing, you also increase the demand. It's analogous to the notorious phenomenon of induced demand for highways, the idea that expanding highways doesn't reduce traffic congestion, it just motivates people to drive on the highways more. I couldn't find any research on this, but I can only assume that the induced demand effect for housing is much smaller than it is for highways. There's just only so many young adults moving out of their parents' homes, couples getting divorced, and so on. Plus, we should want housing for those people. Even if it doesn't lower prices for anyone else, it's still a win. The YouTube channel Oh the Urbanity did 2 videos on this, and they're both excellent. A big point they make is that we usually give away space on highways for free, except for toll roads, whereas housing is sold on a market. If we gave away housing for free, there probably would be a lot more induced demand. But this does raise issues of wealth inequality. Do we want housing going to a young adult moving out of their parents' home, or do we instead want it going to a homeless person? Ideally, we'd have enough housing for everyone and maybe even second homes for at least some people. But given our wealth inequality, there's a role for policy to ensure that everyone has housing. And finally, the big question. If you look across an entire city or country or even the whole world, does building more housing reduce prices? Even this is complicated. It can be tempting to ask, did building more housing cause prices to go down? But that's the wrong question. The right question is, did building more housing cause prices to go down relative to what they would have been if we didn't build the housing? In other words, we are comparing the prices that we would have with or without new housing. That's called a counterfactual, comparing what actually happened to some hypothetical alternative world where the facts went differently. In Austin, Texas, the YIMBYs have taken over the government, and that's led to a big boom in new housing construction. Then, in 2023, average rents in Austin went down by 6%, which is fantastic. But did the new housing cause rents to go lower? 2023 was also a rough year for the economy in Austin due to layoffs in the tech sector. That could also cause housing prices to go down. People in real estate do point to the new housing as one reason why rents went down, and they're probably right, but I haven't seen any careful analysis of it. There was, however, a study on this out of Auckland, New Zealand. The story in Auckland is pretty similar. In 2016, Auckland overhauled their zoning laws, leading to a huge boom in new housing construction. Other cities in New Zealand did not do this. The study compared Auckland to 3 other cities, Hamilton, Tauranga, and Wellington. Christchurch was omitted because it had a major earthquake during the study period, and Queenstown was omitted because, as a tourist town, its economy was hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. For the 4 cities in the study, housing prices grew at similar rates prior to 2016, but then Auckland's new zoning laws kicked in and its prices grew much more slowly. The researchers used that to estimate the counterfactual prices that Auckland would have had without the change in zoning laws. They found that after 6 years, so in 2022, Auckland's actual housing costs were about 20% less expensive than in the counterfactual world without the zoning change. Now, that 20% number is specific to the particular circumstances in Auckland, as well as the details of the research methods used in the study. However, it is still pretty strong evidence that yes, increasing the housing supply does lower prices relative to what they would have been without the new housing, as you would expect from the economics of supply and demand. And that 20%, that's just in Auckland. Because Auckland built so much housing, they probably pulled in some people from other places, which probably reduced housing costs wherever they came from. And there you have it. I hope that having seen all of this, you can understand why a lot of people don't believe that building more housing makes it more affordable, but also why they're mostly wrong. There are some exceptions, in particular the amenity effect and induced demand, but those are exceptions. The primary trend is lower prices even when the new housing is on the expensive side. So yes, we should build more housing, but we should also support the least affluent households who aren't as well served by housing markets. We should try to have economically diverse neighborhoods, and as much as possible, we should try to shift people from car-centric suburban sprawl to walkable, transit-oriented, environmentally sustainable neighborhoods. Fortunately, all of those things can be done at the same time by, among other things, building more medium and high-density housing in our towns and cities, especially the ones that are, right now, the most expensive.